Strike up conversation about fuel in the average waterfront pub this summer, and the subject is bound to turn to the crackpot Belgian policy of fining any yacht found with more than 7 parts in 1,000 of red diesel in its tanks. For Brits, the answer to this nonsense is quite simple. Go somewhere else. With France and Holland on either side, the only problem is which of these splendid destinations to select. For many of us, France isn't far at all, but for the skipper with small tanks and no wind, the Netherlands might pose more of a challenge, which brings me to the nub of this column. My current yacht is designed for ocean work. She has a pair of fill-and-forget fuel tanks, but there's a catch. Neither gauge works. Occasionally in a seaway they burst into life to perjure themselves with shameless optimism. Mostly, though, they sulk on empty and stay there, even with the tanks pressed up full. There are a number of answers to this unsatisfactory situation. The first is the easy one. Chase the wiring all the way and find the corroded contact. I've done that, and there isn't one. The multimeter also suggests continuity, so the simple solution has failed me. Because the gauges themselves occasionally show signs of life, it seems unlikely that both have given up the ghost, which leads to the unpalatable conclusion that the sensors inside the tanks have given up the struggle. I bet you wouldn't fancy breaking the seal on the unions to get them out and see what's going on. Well, neither do I. If I were younger and less experienced, I might have been tempted to have a crack at it, but a lifetime of disillusion has taught me that fuel gauges on sailing yachts are rarely a success once past their first flush of youth. They fall into that category that Jesus would surely have mentioned on his Sermon on the Mount had he had more time. The 8th Beatitude would have appealed to all sailors, spelling out that blessed are they who expect nothing, for they will not be disappointed. Fortunately for me, the builder of my yacht was a hard-bitten realist who understood what the Bible missed out. Knowing the gauges would end up failing, he looked after his customers by installing 2 screw-in, accessible dipsticks which never lie. I augment them by logging all tank fills, engine hours and revs. I know that at 6 knots and 2,000 RPM, Mr. Yanmar burns 2.7 litres an hour with a clean bottom. I work this out by filling the tanks, then running at consistent speeds for a number of hours before refuelling. I prefer not to believe anyone else, or even the engine manufacturer's handbook. He's probably a grand chap, but he's not on my boat, and only she can deliver the real facts. 6 knots, by the way, coincides more or less with the square root of my waterline length, which is the speed above which waves start appearing as the boat forces herself through the water. At 7 knots the revs go through the roof, but they drop dramatically if I slow to 5 when I'm really low on fuel. As always, recourse to the dipstick either brings relief or despair. Whichever it is, it's a fact of life, not some fantasy promoted by a fuel gauge that probably doesn't reach the bottom of the tank anyway. The best substitute for a dipstick is a sight gauge. These aren't often fitted because for them to function you have to be able to eyeball the tank itself. Amel Yachts have come up with a brilliant answer to this, but I've never seen their idea in use anywhere else. My first experience with a basic sight gauge came in 1980. Uncharacteristically, it ended in tears. I was homeward bound from Cherbourg in a scarlet Contessa 32. Red Conqueror was the much-loved tool of my trade as a cruising instructor in those days of freedom, when competent crew courses regularly crossed the channel from the Solent. My colleagues and I maintained a tradition of meeting up with our boats and students at the Master Builder's pub in the Bewley River on the last night of each course. The pub laid on a lively Irish band, the beer wasn't half bad, and the thought police had not yet figured out that it'd be a great idea to ban sailing instructors from drinking, so a good time was had by all. The music was generally in full swing by 2100, and on this occasion we'd 70 miles or so to cover. The shipping forecast promised force 5 from the southwest, so the prospects were perfect for a fast passage, followed by a night we felt we all deserved. As it happened, the tide was due to run foul at the Needles from 2000. From there we had 10 miles or so up to the river, so we needed to be at the lighthouse by 1800. We'd slipped our lines at 0600 and cracked on hard until midday when the wind gave the forecasters the twin fingers of derision and fell away to nothing. We were left crashing around in the shipping lanes with our chances of a good party dying fast, so we started the dear old Sab. I'd read the sight gauge in Cherbourg, and it said half full, which was plenty to get home. We revved her up and continued at the 6 knots of our passage plan. An hour short of the Needles, in the middle of afternoon tea, that utterly reliable engine slowed ominously. I pumped the throttle as you do, but to no avail. Half a minute later it fell silent, leaving us drifting once again. The sea had gone down by now, and we sat like Coleridge's painted ship on a painted ocean, while I tackled the Sab. It didn't take long to discover that we'd run out of diesel. I checked the sight gauge again, but as before, it had the brass neck to indicate half full. Seeking the ultimate arbitration, I held a plastic container under the lowest point on the delivery pipe and loosened the union. Nothing came out. The tank was bone dry, and it was only then that I noticed the tap at the bottom of the sight gauge was firmly shut. I opened it and watched the 5 cc's of diesel it contained drain into the echoing emptiness of the tank. I didn't tell the crew about this blunder. They didn't need to know. The issue was how to get in so as not to miss the bash. My first effort proved a big mistake. There were certainly other training boats out there heading the same way as me. They weren't in sight, however, and when I called them on Channel 16, no reply was forthcoming, so I raised the Coast Guard to ask them to relay a message to my chums that my boat was out of fuel and we'd appreciate somebody swinging by to slip me a couple of gallons. I underlined that I was not in distress, but the zealous officer would have none of it, and threatened me with the Yarmouth lifeboat. I'd met the coxswain, and I could well imagine his comments, where he scrambled to fill up my fuel tank. That wouldn't do at all, so I backtracked hard, and finally persuaded the man on the end of the transmitter that we'd be okay after all. We drifted on with the tide, and were despairing of our night on the tiles when a southbound French yacht appeared from the direction of England. As luck would have it, his track took him close enough for us to signal. He altered course and came over. When asked for diesel, he merely shrugged, and things looked unpromising until one of my students nipped below and came back with a large case of Whitbread's Best Bitter. Proffering this did the trick, and Frenchy came on deck with a 10-litre can of the right stuff. We tipped it into our filler, our benefactor cracked the beer case, we made the pub before closing, and he, doubtless, enjoyed a merrier passage back to civilization. The moral of this sorry event, if you want one, is that while it obviously makes sense to fill the fuel tanks when one can, it pays handsomely to carry plenty of beer as well.